Lamar Waldron, my old friend and colleague and cohort in crime, as it were, writing the books on the Kennedy assassination and other issues. Lamar, welcome back to the program.
Tom?
Hey, Lamar. It's great to have you with us. I started the program today by reading part of an email that you sent me about the America First movement, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. You are a scholar of history in a way that boggles my mind, and I consider myself pretty good with history. Tell us about this.
Well, I mean, people probably heard, at least reports of the Trump foreign policy speech yesterday, the one that was not off the top of his head. I mean, most of the reports said he was, reading it from teleprompters, and it was carefully, crafted and written. So this wasn't something he was making up on the fly. This was his, I'm going to appear to be presidential speech.
Right.
And he kept stressing that the big thing about his foreign policy was it was going to be America first. It was going to be America first, America first. And, of course, any student of history at all recognizes those terms, America first. I mean, it's a very loaded term, like states' rights. Was a term, a code word for being against civil rights. Into the 70s and 80s and probably today. Well, America first has a very checkered history. That actually doesn't go back too far, but it goes back to 1940 and 41 specifically, when the America First Committee was a group of prominent Americans who, attracted regular folks as well, who were opposed to the U.S. Making preparations for war or going to war against especially Nazi Germany, or certainly Japan as well. And again, for some of your listeners who might not have studied history very recently, we need to remember that the America entered World War II December 7th, 1941. We declared war that next day. But the war had been raging in Europe since 1939.
Right.
And the Germans had been grabbing land even before that. So America was already sitting on the sidelines while England, and a lot of your listeners have seen old, newsreel clips on TV of the Battle of Britain and England being bombed and everything. So that was going on, but America was not in the war then. And this group, which originally started out, I think, as a very legitimate peace group. And in fact, it started out on the Yale campus, and several of the people that started the movement that became the America First Committee were people like Gerald Ford, who was in the law school there, Sergeant Shriver, future Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. So these people weren't radicals.
Sergeant Shriver was a good guy. Didn't he start the Peace Corps?
Right.
And he married into the Kennedy family?
Right. Of all those people, Shriver did actually apologize for this later on. But remember, these are college students. But again, let me let your listeners know something. It's very important. Most people don't realize today, because it is left out of most history books, that in the mid-1930s, there had been a congressional committee that had extensively investigated why the U.S. got into World War I, and they had basically turned up a ton of evidence, and this was front-page news in the mid-30s, that the United States munitions industry was largely responsible, in fact, almost exclusively responsible, for the U.S. entering World War I. Again, another war that had been raging, I believe, for maybe 3 years before the U.S. got into it. It's not like Germany attacked us for World War I.
So is this a fact of history, or was this the public perception?
It was called the Nye Committee. You can look it up. I actually wrote about it some in Watergate: The Hidden History. Because there were so many of these committees. The Nye Committee investigated, why the U.S. got into World War I. A famous British military officer in 1929 had written a best-selling book in England, later published here, that basically said the same thing there, that the English munitions industry had basically been behind World War I. Because if you think about it, World War I, I think the Kaiser's grandmother was, Queen Victoria.
Yeah, and to this day, I haven't been able to figure out why we got into World War I.
Yes, I mean, it was, Archduke Ferdinand assassin, so, I mean, it was basically to make money. There's a great picture in Smithsonian Magazine, for the first 3 years, the U.S. was just, making tons of money. They had to keep the New York Stock Exchange open 24 hours a day because there was so much money being made and stocks being traded. So basically, World War I, it came out, like I said, first in England in this book from 1929, and then that led eventually, once the Democrats took over Congress after the Republican Depression started, which is, of course, what it was called back then. It wasn't the Great Depression, as I learned from you and confirmed. It was the Republican Depression. But so this Nye Committee had found that it was basically the U.S. munitions industry was behind us getting into World War I. So that's why these college students, then as now, they were really in tune. They didn't want to fight in another trumped-up foreign war. So
just to make money for the munitions industry.
Right. So that's why, so I wouldn't fault Gerald Ford, Gore Vidal, great writer. He was 15 years old at Phillips Exeter Academy, the exclusive private school. He started the first America First chapter at that, America's most distinguished private high school. So, but these are young people who, really don't know a lot about the world. I have to point out, in all fairness, John F. Kennedy did donate $100. He didn't join the America First Committee, but, at first it sounded like an interesting idea. And, of course, his father wasn't big on war with Germany either. But, so JFK was not a member of the America First Committee, but he donated $100 to it. But what we have to realize, what soon happened, so nobody remembers that stuff. But what people do remember, if they remember anything or they've studied anything about the America First Committee was the views of its key spokesman, who was Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, who had made the first solo transatlantic flight. Now, Lindbergh's father had been a member of Congress who had been against the entry into World War I. Lindbergh, as we know now from a lot of published correspondence and everything, was a horrible racist, an extreme white supremacist, an anti-Semite, and a guy who admired Germany so much. I mean, he kept going over there. Hermann Goering, one of the highest Nazi leaders, gave him a medal. At one point in the late 1930s, and this is after Hitler's been in power, and there have been all these newspaper articles about the horrible treatment of the Jews. Lindbergh even planned to move to Germany and live there because he thought it was just so great. So Lindbergh and a bunch of other kind of borderline, certainly pro-fascist people, basically took over this little student group, and they made this official committee, the America First Committee, whose goal was to keep America out of World War II.
Now, if I'm a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old or a 60-year-old, and it's 1935, and I know, or I believe that I know, that World War I, that the United States got dragged into World War I because the weapons manufacturers lobbied Congress to make it happen, and now there's talk about World War II, I would be skeptical, and I'm not a fascist. I mean,
and like I say, I think the committee started with the best of intentions by these college students at Yale, and that was in September of 1940. Right. But by the spring of 1941, this is still many months before the U.S. is going to enter the war, those students were they weren't running this at all. It's kind of like the Tea Party, I guess, for a good example, which again has some pretty shady origins, but by some accounts, it was a sort of grassroots movement that almost immediately got co-opted, by the very Republican establishment that they were supposedly rebelling against. So the same thing happened here. So you had like the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, the head of Sears. You had all these big businessmen who basically took over the America First Committee, but their main spokesperson was Charles Lindbergh. Okay, and Americans knew and were somewhat uncomfortable with the fact he was a big admirer of Hitler, but they still didn't want to go to war. But Lindbergh kept giving these more and more outrageous speeches, and finally, by September of 41, he gives this speech where all of these newspapers were saying his admiration for Hitler was just completely obvious. And he was starting to blame the, quote, Jews for the pressure on the U.S. to go to war. I'll tell you this, we've all seen the old newsreel footage of the Battle of Britain, Britain bravely standing against that Nazi onslaught. Lindbergh and the America First Committee did not, once the bigwigs took it over, the powerful industrialists in Lindbergh took it over, they didn't even want the U.S. to provide any help to England. And, of course, you had big companies at the time, the forerunner of Exxon, like Standard Oil, and Ford and General Motors. And, of course, Henry Ford was a big Nazi supporter, too, big fan of Hitler. They were selling equipment and Exxon, the version of it then, Standard Oil, they were selling, oil to Nazi Germany to bomb England.
Wow.
The First Committee did not even want us to provide any kind of help to England at all, let alone go to war.
Amazing. Lamar, we've got to take about a 4-minute break here. We'll be back on the other side of the break to wrap this story up. I find the whole thing fascinating. And I'd like to get your thoughts on whether Donald Trump just kind of innocently blundered into this or if there's something underneath all
You're
this.
listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're talking with Lamar Waldron, the author of numerous books on history. I'll get a list for you when we come back. Stick around. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Lamar Waldron on the line with us, historian, author. Lamar, what's the most recent book in the websites that you would like people to know about?
The most recent book and website is The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination.com.
Okay, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination.com. And, of course, the title of the book is The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination.
Right, and then the one most relevant to this, it does actually mention, like, say, the committee that discovered the reason for World War I, is The Hidden History of, is Watergate, The Hidden History.
And your book on Watergate, which is absolutely mind-boggling and brilliant. So my question, not Ted Cruz, Donald Trump yesterday is using this phrase "America First" in this speech that was clearly written for him by his foreign policy advisors, whomever they may be. It wasn't basically the way he talks and et cetera. It was clearly, a lot of thought went into it. Do you think that the guys around him or he himself had intended for there to be any connection to this well-intentioned movement in the United States in the early 30s that turned into basically a huge anti-Semitic, racist movement toward the end of the 30s, the early 40s, or was this just a bad coincidence, a poor choice of terms?
According to Trump's own spokespeople, while no one actually says other people wrote the speech, as you said, it's clear other people did. It was his thoughts and his feelings. In other words, nobody was.
Well, but what's wrong with putting America first? I mean, if you don't know the historical context, I would say, hey, in fact, I've said that on this program. Our trade deals
but
don't.
Remember, Trump is no dummy. He went to some of the best schools, and what is shocking to me is when you look at the parallels between Trump and Charles Lindbergh. And I actually did a Google search where I was going back before this week. In other words, were people pointing out Lindbergh-Trump parallels in the summer, in the fall, 2 months ago? And I have to say, yes, they were. There were many, many people pointing these things out. Just look at the parallels. You've got Lindbergh was an ardent, racist and basically a fascist. Donald Trump. We've all heard the racist rhetoric coming from him, the admiration for fascist dictators in the world today. And, again, this is nothing recent on Trump's part. His history of racism goes back to the front page of the New York Times in 1973 with the housing discrimination of he and his father. So, racism...
Where they refused to rent or sell to people of color.
That's right, and that went on for a long time. Now, Trump's own father was reportedly arrested, according to the Washington Post, in 1927 after a Klan riot in Queens, New York. Now, the person arrested had the exact same name as Trump's father and lived at the exact same address as Trump's father. So I will say...
How many Fred Trumps are there out there?
Well, and the arrest was reported in the newspaper, so that's pretty clear. And then again, Trump is not only pro-fascist like Lindbergh was, both were huge womanizers. Trump, by his own admission, most people don't realize.
But Lamar, you could say that of John Kennedy.
Well, except the way that Kennedy was not pro-fascist. Okay.
Yeah.
Kennedy was not a racist. Kennedy is the guy who risked his run for the presidency in 1960 by making that call to Martin Luther King's wife when King was in prison here in Georgia and was probably going to be killed in prison. So John Kennedy was the opposite of someone like Charles Lindbergh or Trump. And I do just want to work in about Lindbergh and Trump, because Trump's a big womanizer. Lindbergh, most of your listeners don't realize, had at least 3 German mistresses. Remember how much Lindbergh admired Germany, and at least 5 illegitimate children, all while presenting this family-friendly kind of family values type thing.
Yeah, was this post-Lindbergh baby being snatched? I mean, that had to be a huge stressor on his marriage.
Sure, but this was 15 years after that, at least. And those are the mistresses. 2 of his mistresses were even sisters, and he was carrying on with them at the same time. And this has been proven by DNA, the illegitimate kids. So again, Lindbergh was your classic guy who presented, this patriotic family values front, while in private he was saying, he was doing and saying other things, just as Hunt's new advisor on the delegates, told that Republican gathering in Florida, look, Trump's been just saying this for public consumption, but, once he gets the nomination, he'll really, he'll say something different.
Yeah.
And Lindbergh, this is what worries me. Lindbergh was admired then, is still admired now. Lindbergh, the America First Committee that Lindbergh was basically the spokesperson for, did fold within a few days of the Pearl Harbor attack.
Right.
But 10 days after Pearl Harbor, there was a big gathering of these America First types at the home of a Wall Street broker in New York City. And there were luckily FBI and military intelligence informants there, or I think some people were so shocked at what they heard Lindbergh and the others say that they wanted to do their patriotic duty. And they were basically, making plans for what happened when either America got defeated or they could take power, and they'd have to lay low. And then, Lindbergh was going to lead the U.S. to victory in a negotiated peace with Germany. I mean, just pretty treasonous.
Was any of this tied into the Smedley Butler overthrow? The coup against Roosevelt stuff? That was much earlier, I know.
Only in a roundabout way. Again, I cover that in Watergate: The Hidden History too. So what most people know, have never heard of, but those who do know it as the business plot.
Right.
In the early 1930s, pretty much one of the only super rich people in America to back Roosevelt was Joe Kennedy, which is why he was later made ambassador.
Right. And head of the SEC.
But most of the other big super rich guys in America, like the DuPont family, they were totally against Roosevelt.
Lamar, we're out of time. I always love having you on and talking with you. You are such a scholar. What, again, the book and the website?
The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination.com, and always a pleasure talking with you.
Great. Thank you so much. Lamar Waldron, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known in my life.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.